a good starting point because it's the first version of the story, at least of which I'm aware, to explicitly link Pinocchio to the idea of artificial intelligence. You'll notice from the date that this movie was released at the turn of the millennium, and this was a time of widespread anxieties about advancing technology and Y2K, and that means the year 2000. The protagonist of the film is David, an AI robot that is programmed to love. He's adopted by a couple, but they soon are disturbed by David's behaviors, which mimic those of a human, but are not quite there. And this is a great example, by the way, of the uncanny valley. The couple finally give David away, leaving him to roam the world in this liminal state. He's yearning for his mother's love, as he's programmed to do, but he's unable to be loved in return since he's a robot. And just in case we in the audience missed the analogy, Spielberg adds several Pinocchio references. After David is abandoned by his family, he remembers Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio and becomes convinced that if he finds the blue fairy, he can become a human child and earn his mother's love. At the end of the film, we're in a distant future in which humanity has gone extinct and AI robots evolved from models like David populate the Earth. They communicate to David through a blue fairy animation, which you can see in the image here, and artificially reconstruct his family from his memories. The movie closes with the projection of his mother telling him that she loves him, even though by this time his human family is long dead. This film calls into question our definition of humanity, as you can see from the tagline on the poster. His love is real, but he is not. Is David's love real if it is programmed? What differentiates the electrical impulses of a computer brain and the chemical reactions in the human brain that produce what we call love? Why is it that David passes the so-called duck test for humanity? He looks like a human and acts like a human, but his human mother is unable to love him. And how does the figure of David obscure the boundaries between AI and humanity? And these are questions that have since been brought up as well in numerous literary and cinematic works. We're going to move on now to our next example, but keep those questions floating in your heads. We're now arriving at the one that started it all. This is the 1883 children's novel, Le avventure di Pinocchio, storia di un burattino, written by Carlo Collodi. Collodi invented Pinocchio, and the figure became so popular that it quickly spawned what are known in Italian as Pinocchiate. Today, we might call this fan fiction. They're basically works by other authors involving Pinocchio and his universe. Collodi's novel has been a bestseller since its publication and is the most translated work of Italian literature, as well as one of the most translated books of all time. There's even an academic subfield called Pinocchiology. But let's go back to the context of the original story, and this is Pinocchio's birth, if you will. This coincides with a very particular point in Italian history, and some of you may be surprised to know that as a political state, Italy, in fact, is quite young. Italy was unified as a country in 1861. However, although it was a single political entity on paper, it was apparent almost immediately that a cultural and even linguistic unification, a sense of camaraderie and patriotism, would not be quickly achieved. And in fact, we have a well-known quote from this area that is by the statesman Massimo d'Azeglio, who observes, "L'Italia è fatta, restano da fare gli italiani." We have made Italy, now we must make Italians. Now, Collodi did not set out to write a political allegory with Pinocchio. It's definitely a fantasy novel written for children. However, his context did influence him, and as Pinocchio learns how to be a contributing member of society, being a good boy and obeying his father, we can see how the parents reading alongside their children may simultaneously be learning how they may too learn to be good Italians and obey the new state. So with this in mind, let's take a look. The first thing I'd like you to see is Pinocchio's creation. And here on the screen, you can see the opening lines of the novel. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. The first person to come into contact with this wood, the carpenter, Master Cherry, who you can see on the left, intends to make a table leg out of it. But as he begins to work with this ordinary piece of wood, it shows off extraordinary characteristics. It yelps in pain when he cuts it, and it giggles as he sands it. Pinocchio seems to experience and react to sensations even as unformed material. You're likely familiar with the figure on the right, Geppetto, who receives the wood from Master Cherry. It is Geppetto who names Pinocchio, And even before he is fully carved, Pinocchio behaves like a human child. He sticks out his tongue as soon as his mouth is formed. He runs away as soon as he has feet. Geppetto himself seems to forget almost immediately that Pinocchio is a puppet, and he calls him a scamp of a child, my boy, and again, wicked child. He simultaneously, however, acknowledges that Pinocchio is a puppet and Geppetto's own creation, commenting that he worked so hard to make him a nice puppet, and seems to at least take partial responsibility for his creation's actions when he concludes, I should have known better. When Pinocchio meets the Blue Fairy, she more clearly delineates the boundaries between object and human. Humanity, it would seem, is a reward for good behavior, as Pinocchio will cease to be a puppet and be a proper boy when he deserves it. Something strange in this passage is the Blue Fairy's allusion to a puppet's life cycle. They're seemingly mortal as they are born as puppets, live as puppets, and die as puppets. And in fact, in the original version of the novel, Pinocchio dies at the end, and Collodi only changed it after his fans, or really his fans' parents, wrote to him and complained. So this leaves us wondering, what exactly is the difference between being a puppet and being human? Let's see if we can gain some insight from the conclusion. After developing a strong work ethic and taking care of his ailing father, Pinocchio wakes up one day and finds that not only he, but his whole house has transformed. And as Geppetto explains, when children go from bad to good, they have the power of making things take on a bright new look inside with their families too. An odd detail is that Pinocchio's human body does not replace the puppet body. Instead, he asks where the old Pinocchio of wood is, and Geppetto indicates this large, lifeless wooden puppet propped on a chair. And the new human Pinocchio looks at it, and we're left with this final line. This is the final line of the novel. How funny I was when I was a puppet, and how glad I am now that I've become a proper boy. We're getting ready to continue to our next example, but before we do, I'll mention that the Italian word for puppet, burattino, has the same connotations as in English. It's someone whose every movement is controlled by another, a conformist. So when we look at this picture again, we can ask ourselves, who is the real puppet? Was Pinocchio perhaps more like a human child when he was a disobedient toy, rather than this quote unquote real boy who has learned how to conform to societal expectations to the point of having this out of body experience? And again, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. But for now, let's move along to a version with which I imagine you are all familiar. This is Disney's 1940 animated film. And I'll just briefly mention the context that you can probably already guess given the date. The film was released on the brink of World War II. And in fact, the scholar Robin Allen notes that the dark themes in Disney's Pinocchio at this time of international turmoil may partially explain its initial failure at the box office. But since we're focusing today on issues of human identity, I'll move on to the transformation of Pinocchio from puppet to human in this version. Unlike in Collodi's version, Pinocchio begins without consciousness, more like a real puppet, if you want to call it that. You can see how the animators included the rounded eyes to emphasize the inanimate nature of Pinocchio's initial state. The Blue Fairy then animates Pinocchio in response to Geppetto's wish for him to become human. She tells him that the final transformation will come if he proves himself to be, quote, brave, truthful, and unselfish. Pinocchio pulls it off by the conclusion of the film, as you can see in this last image. And here I'm going to turn again to the words of Robin Allen. He says that in the Disney version, we forget that he is a puppet. And this is emphasized at the end of the film when he does become a real boy. The only thing that changes is his nose. The face remains the same, but the animated real child is a disappointment. This is just another American kid. The wooden nose, the icon of difference, has vanished and sympathy for the hero is lost. So while the Disney version is certainly a departure in many ways from Collodi's original, both leave us with this similar feeling of disappointment when Pinocchio finally becomes human. We lose interest in this sanitized version of a child who seems by his almost inhuman degree of obedience to be more wooden than when he was literally made out of wood. So we'll turn to our last example now. This is Pinocchio by the Mexican director Guillermo del Toro, and it was released by Netflix in 2022. Notably, since this is a stop motion animated feature, this is the only version of the story of the puppet that is in fact made with puppets. And as you can see from the central transposed image on the movie poster, Del Toro is very interested in the intersections between human and puppet identities. Del Toro is famous for having a specific vision for his projects and making his artistic choices very purposefully. So I'll be using quotes from him to guide us through our brief discussion of his film. First, he recognizes a link between Pinocchio and another famous fictional figure, sometimes thought of as a pre-modern example of AI. This is Frankenstein's monster, by the way, that I'm referencing. Del Toro says, I've always been very intrigued by the links between Pinocchio and Frankenstein. They're both about a child that is thrown into the world. They are both created by a father who then expects them to figure out what is good, what is bad, the ethics, the morals, love, life, and essentials on their own. Del Toro chooses to return his Pinocchio story to its original Italian setting, but instead of the mid-19th century, he chooses the mid-20th, that is Italy under fascism. The setting layers even more complexity on questions of humanity in the story, as it takes place at a time when basic human rights were denied and human adherents of fascism behaved in inhuman ways. The so-called Ventennio Nero, or Black 20 years between 1922 and 1943, saw the imprisonment and assassination of fascism's opposers, the censorship of the press, the oppression of women's rights, the persecution of individuals based on race, sexuality, and physical or intellectual ability, aggressive imperialism and colonialism, and called for a complete surrender to fascist ideologies at the expense of individual free thinking. This is the backdrop of Del Toro's version of the story, and as he says, blind obedience is not a virtue. The virtue Pinocchio has is to disobey. At a time when everybody else behaves as a puppet, he does not. This helps us to understand why Del Toro chooses not to transform Pinocchio into a human at the end of the story. After all, while many humans in his story do not show any regard or for human dignity or life, why would becoming flesh and blood be a model to follow or a symbol for having achieved something? Del Toro himself says, to me, it is essential to counter the idea that you have to change into a flesh and blood child to be a real human. All you need to be a human is to really behave like one, you know? I have never believed that transformation should be demanded to gain love. Del Toro's film is set in fascist Italy, but it was made in, and we the audience live in, the digital age, the age of AI. Is there something that his version of the story can reveal to us specifically? How do we cope with a world in which the non-human approaches the human? How do we as humans retain our humanity? Del Toro does not give us easy answers, but he does give us an idea of where to look for them. He essentially tells us that we must do what we have started to do here today together, that is to communicate with each other. And in this last quote, he focuses on children, but I would argue that in this quickly moving and uncertain age, we are all children. These are times, he says, that demand from kids a complexity that is tremendous, far more daunting, I think, than when I was a child. Kids need answers and reassurances. For me, this is both for children and adults that talk to each other. It tackles very deep ideas about what makes us human. And building off Del Toro's words, I'll say that these types of conversations with your professors and with each other, and this is the core of the work that you'll be doing at USD. So before I leave you today, I'll just offer some suggestions for further exploration. First, if you'd like to read Collodi's novel, there is an excellent bilingual edition with the Italian and English on facing pages, published by UC Press, and this is where I've taken your reading for this week. If you don't have time for that, completely understandable. I do recommend Matteo Garrone's 2019 Pinocchio film, which is an extremely faithful adaptation of the novel. It's quite gritty. And this is Roberto Benigni, by the way, if you know him playing Geppetto. I, of course, highly recommend the Pinocchio film by Del Toro. This is also the making of special, which you can find on Netflix, where you can see the puppetry behind the puppet, and it's quite fascinating. The animators are very talented. It is called hand-carved cinema, by the way. And to give you an idea of the continued study of Pinocchio, this is a conference happening at Brown University in October. It's called Strings of Imagination, Rethinking Pinocchio in the New Millennium. And I saw that one of the keynote speakers, Professor Viganò, studies how fairy tales like Pinocchio can be used to explain cybersecurity. So we'll see what kind of connections he makes there. The possibilities, the Pinocchio possibilities are endless. So with that, I'll close and leave it to our next speakers. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asara. That's fascinating. I always find it interesting when we take a really modern issue, what seems like something new that we're facing, and we find that people have been thinking about some of these issues maybe a little differently, but thinking at the heart of those issues for a long time. So very, very interesting connections there. And I hope you all get take the time to follow one of those recommendations and read or watch more to further give context to this. Wonderful. Thanks so much again. Next is Professor Ford. Professor Ford teaches in the history department and is going to talk to you about Afrofuturist theory, politics, and aesthetics through the lens of AI. Please take it away, Professor Ford.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Terrell. And thank you also to all of the amazing professors and all of you, the amazing students who we get the privilege of teaching this year. I was really fascinated by that, Professor Asaro. Thank you so much. I was really curious to see how you would turn this into such a really fascinating discussion, and I'm thoroughly impressed. So thank you so much. And I think that that is a great lead into my presentation as well. I'm just making sure that my sound is correct, that you guys can hear it properly. We don't have any issues. Okay, yes, computer audio. Okay. All righty. Fix that if we need to. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up if you can see a part. Okay, very cool. All right, so a little bit about me. So my name is Professor Matt Ford. I'm very happy to be with you all today. If anyone has anything to say, please unmute yourselves because I cannot see you. Okay, do a quick time check. Okay, great. And so I teach history. I teach U.S. history through Reconstruction through 1877 at the history department, and I also teach an advanced course called Black History Theory and Aesthetics, a very long name that I will probably change the name to by the time you guys take this course. So looking forward to seeing you guys in the near future. Also just want to say welcome to college. I went to Vassar College and studied anthropology, which kind of led me to where I am today in these in cultural studies, and then also just finished my MFA at UCSD. Okay. So today we are going to, let's actually backtrack for a second. Today we're going to talk about Afrofuturist liberation through the lens of AI. I want to bring all those big words that I used in my original title into just liberation. That's what we're talking about today. We're just talking about freedom using technology, specifically for African diasporic peoples. But really this is for everyone, because I thoroughly believe that when Black people are free, we are all free. And so I want to kick it off with some guiding questions and themes that we'll be exploring today and in our section on Wednesday for those of you who will have me. So first, this is a little bit of my own personal theorization, so just bear with me. I believe that if you can shape someone's God, you can shape their sense of self and shape their world. And we are responsible for that world and how it impacts others. You cannot forget or deny your actions or your complicity. And we can expand the word God. One, obviously, this is a Catholic institution. And I actually kind of want to expand the word God into this being source, life, whatever God is for you. If it's the world, the universe, whatever word you use for God, it's all the same thing. We're really just talking about the world at large. So if you can shape someone's environment, you can shape everything that they see, then you can shape their sense of self and you can shape their world. Moving on, by the amazing Professor Leonard Jeffries, who's also a historian, I want to share this quote with you. Whoever controls the images controls your self-esteem. your self-respect, and your self-development. Whoever controls the history controls the vision. So I just want us all to be aware of history, the world that was before and the world that is to come, and that we are in control of that world. So I also want us to understand a couple of questions that would just help us through this discussion. So first, the world is always yours to make of it what you want. AI is just another tool. How will you use it, and how will you prevent its use from hurting others? So AI is not taking over the world if we don't want it to. It is simply another tool that we are using, and that it's up to you to decide how you want to use it. And then our last question, how can African diasporic history and Afrofuturist literature teach us about our agency in creating a safe technological future for ourselves? What safe practices must we prioritize? So we'll talk about some of those safe practices in our presentation today. So first, I've identified more or less 5 kind of potential harms in AI. So I want to start off by saying that AI is not new. Technology is not new. The internet, like none of these things are brand new. We have had some kind of AI for the past 100 years. And so these are just a couple of potential harms that we've already faced and that we have the potential of facing in already in our recent history and in our near future. So first, erasure and a lack of representation. Second, economic disenfranchisement, data privacy, false information, and the dangerous imitation of life. And then lastly, I have here in question marks, this is the future that we are creating. And so it is up to us, those other potential harms in AI. Time check. Okay, great. Okay, so 1, economic disenfranchisement. So according to a report by the McKinsey Institute for the study of Black economic mobility, coming by 2045, there is a potential $43 billion wealth gap for Black Americans. What does this mean? This just sounds like a large number. What does this actually mean? So this means that Black folks will be displaced from high mobility jobs that don't require 4-year degrees. So a high mobility job is simply a job at which you can quickly ascend in the economic ladder without needing a 4-year degree. Luckily for you all are in college, but we also must be aware of the people who either chose not to go to college, or who may be going to 2-year degree institutions, or may have, maybe you're Beyonce and you didn't need a degree, just who are the other people who we need to be aware of in the world. And so the McKinsey Institute identified 8 pillars of Black economic mobility. 1, financial inclusion. This just means, where are Black people in the market? Do we have access to wealth aggregation, wealth accrual, just where are we in the market? Second, credit and ecosystem development for small businesses. So how are Black folks able to create their own businesses and sustain themselves into the future? 3, health. Your health is your wealth. So if you don't have good health, then you have nothing. And so we'll actually go into a couple of examples of how the health industry, of how Black folks have been impacted in the health industry concerning AI. 4, workforce and jobs. So again, those high mobility jobs, where are you in the job market? Are you able to sustain a job? Or many of us fear that AI would take all of our jobs for us. 5, pre-K to 12 education. So if technology is our new metric for knowledge and for accruing understanding of the world, well, technology should be a pretty important part of education from very early on in our childhood. This should not come in high school or in college. This should come very early on. 6, the digital divide. So just how are we being divided based on race, gender, sexuality, ability, age, these different parts of our identities based on our access to technology or inaccess to technology, our lack of access. 7, affordable housing. So similar to the way that a lot of resumes are scanned with AI in order to see whether someone qualifies for a job, this also happens a lot in the housing market. So are people being displaced from access to housing simply because of a human-like scan? And then lastly, public infrastructure, just our ability to live, work, and play in the world. And we'll go through a couple of examples of that as well. So second, I want to point our attention to erasure and lack of representations. What you see before you is just a bunch of headlines over the past 6 or so years as we've quickly developed AIs. So I'll just read a couple of these to clue you into some of the things that we need to be aware of and the things that are some pretty scary things that are happening, especially concerning Black folks in America. So an MIT researcher found that artificial intelligence has a race problem and we need to fix it. This was a report from, I believe, the Wall Street Journal. From Vox, color film was built for white people. Here's what it did to dark skin. So just to explain this a little bit. So speaking back to 100 years ago, as I had talked about earlier. So when color film cameras were developed, they were made to not capture dark skin because, well, who was actually creating those cameras? Not us, not people who are melanated. And so people were easily kind of blurred out of cameras. And this was eventually fixed in the 1990s, but this is still a problem that we face with modern cameras today. According to Yahoo News, key medical devices are failing to diagnose Black patients accurately, according to research. Why can't a soap dispenser identify dark skin? We see different examples of equipment that is supposed to scan. So again, those color films, very similarly to the way that melanated skin is not read by artificial intelligence. Now we also have Black folks who are teaching other people to photograph Black skin because, well, if we're not going to teach others ourselves, well, how do we expect that to actually change in the industry? I'll skip through a couple of more of these, but one that I really want us to focus on in particular is the way that police facial recognition technology can't tell Black people apart. So we saw this happening as early as 2018, where a lot of AI-powered facial recognition, so the cameras that are on either cameras in that are attached to traffic lights in public or on cameras in public, or even to the camcorders are attached to police officers, would not be able to tell Black folks apart. And you had this huge phenomenon, really unfortunate phenomena of Black people being confused for each other and being charged with crimes for which they did not commit. And so these are some of those examples. I'll skip through a couple of those, a couple of these in the interest of time. So 3, data privacy and civil rights. So again, going back through history, as early as the 1940s and 1950s, McCarthyism, for those of you who don't know, this was the US Senator McCarthy and the Red Scare, which was really a second wave of a Red Scare in which communists or people who were assumed to be communists would be hunted and broken up and arrested. So this is just one example of the way that our civil rights are being taken away. In the 1950s and 1960s, the US government and the FBI would surveil Dr. MLK as well as members of the Black Panther Party in order to get information on them and to figure out what's happening in their fight against structural racism. In the 80s and 90s, we had folks who were going to the doctor to test for HIV and AIDS, who may also be treated for HIV and AIDS. They feared that the healthcare systems by their employers would scan and would be able to find them out, and they would lose their jobs. And even in recent history, with the Black Lives Matter movement, as early as 2014, when the movement really started, the Department of Homeland Security was able to surveil and collect data on Black Lives Matter's activists. And then in 2020, that same data was used for phone tracking systems to see who was showing up to protest. Okay, moving along. This is a pretty terrifying example. We won't spend too long on this, but this is an advertisement that was created by the Donald Trump administration in support of his current election for US president, in which he used deep fakes. These are AI-generated images of Black people in support of Donald Trump. So deep fakes and misinformation and a lot of pretty terrifying things are happening out there in terms of AI. Lastly, I don't know if we'll have time for this. I'm trying to check time. If I'm running over, please just cut me off, Professor Turl. But I'll show this really quick clip. One of our favorite movies, I, Robot. And so I'm sure that many of you have seen this. This was 20 years ago in 2004. They're currently making a new version of iRobot. So I'm really fascinated to see how we're thinking of AI in the modern day 20 years later. But this is just a quick clip of a robot, which we do have today. I'm sure many of you have seen them on the news of a robot being interrogated. So I'll show about a minute of this.
My father tried to teach me human
If you can't hear it, please let me know.
They are difficult.
You mean you're a designer?
Yes.
So why'd you murder him?
I did not murder Dr. Lanning.
Want to explain why you were hiding at the crime scene?
I was frightened.
Robots don't feel fear. They don't feel anything. They don't get hungry. They don't sleep.
I do. I have even had dreams.
Human beings have dreams. Even dogs have dreams, but not you. You are just a machine. An imitation of life. Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
I think you murdered him because he was teaching you to simulate emotions and things got out of control.
I did not murder him.
But emotions don't seem like a very useful simulation for a robot.
I did not murder him.
What the hell, I don't want my toaster or my vacuum cleaner appearing emotional.
I did not murder him!
That one's called anger. Ever simulate anger before?
Okay, all right. So in the interest of time, we'll stop it right there about a minute early. But as you can see, well, the jury is still out in terms of whether AI can have souls and whether they can have emotions. But hey, you know, like I said, the future is yours. So whether we get there, that is up to you. But the question that I want us to be thinking about here is in what ways are we having robots or AI imitate life? In what ways are we replicating human life? In what ways are we safely replicating human life? In what ways are we creating new friends on the internet? So there's this phenomenon of a lot of people making new friends on the internet. This is essentially a robot without a face. So the question here is really just how are we having humans imitate life, and how can we do so safely? And then the last slide here, I just want to direct us to Octavia Butler. We'll deal with her on Wednesday in our section, but I just want us to read this brief quote before we move on. Quickly, for those of you who read this short story, hopefully you had a chance to. This is a quote from the Book of Martha, a short story by the amazing Octavia Butler, who is a Black science fiction writer who passed away in 2006. And she is known for a lot of amazing, amazing books, including Parable of the Sower, which I just read this summer, which completely changed my life. And so she oftentimes brings up really important, vital questions about humanity in her work, and allows us to imagine other worlds, other dimensions, other futures in which we can create a safe, sustainable life. And so in this short story, essentially God pulls Martha, this Black woman, away out of her world in Seattle and gives her this huge mission to essentially come up with one way and only one to save humanity. And so God says, this is what you're to do, God said. You will help humankind to survive its greedy, murderous, wasteful adolescence. Help it to find less destructive, more peaceful, sustainable ways to live. This is your job. This is so again, whatever you call God, the universe, whether you say light source, your professors, you know, whomever, you have a calling on your life to do something about humankind? This is a question that I always ask my students. Okay, this is all the history that we have. Now, what are you going to do about it? So I will leave you with that question, and I will see you on Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ford. I want to take a moment to second how life-changing reading Octavia Butler can be. I've been teaching Butler for about 15 years now. In every class I can work her writing into, because it's, well, prophetic, unfortunately. Actually, we just, I don't know if celebrate's the right word, but July 20th, which happens to also be my birthday, was the first day in the journal entries for Parable of the Sower. I don't know how I'm both sort of delighted at the connection and also think it's inauspicious that my birthday is shared with that day. But basically, we are, you know, she wrote that book in the, I think, 1993 or something like that, 30 years ago. And here we are in her future that she was writing about. And as Professor Ford mentioned, she passed away in 2006. And there are far too many things that she was dead on about, or close, or it feels like we're on that path, all those things. Some of them really dead on, some far too close, and some, well, maybe we're not there, but I don't like the way we're headed. And so that's in a particularly interesting book set in the LA area. So for those of you familiar with Southern California, it will feel familiar in some eerie ways. Anyhow, I highly recommend Parable of the Sower as a beginning point, but all of her books are wonderful. And the sequel, Parable of the Talents. Sorry to go on and on, but honestly, there's not a writer that has influenced me more than Octavia Butler, I think. And whether you're interested in politics, environmental issues, social issues, political, basically how politics binds all of those things together. I mean, it's her book it's fiction, but it's also meant to make us think about some of the most important questions we're facing. Okay, I'm going to contain myself, but I highly recommend.
I just want to say really quick, just thanks for that. I mean, this is the power of Octavia Butler. So please, everyone, go buy her book immediately. Also, happy belated birthday. My godfather texted me on July 20th when he started reading the book and was like, whoa, and what's happening in the election? Just go read the book, kids. Go read.
Parable of the Sower. It's fantastic. And there is, if you feel like I don't have the time for a novel, it's worth making the time. But there's also a really interesting graphic novel version that came out a few years ago. If you're into graphic novels, another way to take that book in. So fantastic. Well, next, oh, there it is. There it is. Next, we have another fascinating entry for today. We were just thinking about deepfakes a little. We're going to think a lot more about it because Dr. Beck is going to talk to us about the issue of deepfakes. An expert on this from the Department of Communication. Please take it away. Let us know, because I'm curious about deepfakes. I'm kind of concerned. I see people sharing things on social media that I look at and I think, well, that's clearly fake. But then I wonder how many things did I kind of accept that passed and I didn't even think about it. So I'm fascinated to learn more.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Turrell. Yeah, if only it is easy to detect the deepfakes. Let me pull up the slides first. Let me see. Do you see the screen? Okay. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Jian Sophia Beck. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, and I teach and study the regulations of emerging media and communication technologies. And I particularly look at how we as a member of society have all these different views about what's the best way to regulate and govern these emerging technologies, including the artificial intelligence we'll be talking about, as well as the impact these regulations have on marginalized communities in specific. And every semester, I have been teaching media law and policy class in the Department of Communication. So if any of you are interested in the legal policy issues surrounding these new technologies, I highly invite you to consider my class, and we will have a chance to explore more about the deepfakes as well as other issues. So today, I'm going to cover the issue of deepfakes more specifically. And thank you, Dr. Asaro and Dr. Ford, to kind of really pose the important questions as to what it means to be human, as well as different issues, including deepfakes and misinformation that is having huge impacts on individuals and society more broadly. So on that note, this is a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to cover within the limited time we have. So first, I'd like to go over what we mean by deepfakes, really. What is deepfake? And then I'd like to highlight the issue of the unconsented deepfake pornography in particular, because there are so many issues out there, and within the limited time, I just chose to cover just one specific issue at stake. And last but not least, I'd like to discuss whether we have appropriate protections and regulations in place for us to really think about ways to address these issues as a society. So what we mean by deepfakes? What is deepfake? It is really important for us to define what we're talking about before getting into any further discussions, because we may be talking about something a little bit different if you're not having a clear definition. So deepfakes can be defined as a form of synthetic media content, which uses different kinds of artificial intelligence techniques, AI, to create very realistic depictions of people and or events. And generally speaking, deepfakes are basically digitally manipulated to emulate another's likeness. The thing is, these AI-generated content has exploded in recent years, particularly because we can now access all these tools more easily, and the use of ease has been really accessible over time. Previously, we would have probably needed a certain level of technical skill or knowledge to really use AI to make this deepfake content, but nowadays it's just often a matter of downloading an app or clicking a few buttons on a website, or if you're a little more tech savvier than others, you may have access to open source codes out there to create your own. And in fact, a 2019 Vice article, for example, found that we just need 15 seconds of any Instagram story of a person to really create a quiet, reliable deepfake. And the technology has only gotten more accessible ever since. Oh, sorry. I think. Yeah, I was meaning to introduce that I'm going to take a look at certain examples. So let's take a look at a few examples. I will play this very brief clip for all of us. Let me see why I can't play. Okay.
You guys cool if I play some sports? This may look and sound like Tom Cruise, but this is not the Hollywood actor.
I am not Morgan Freeman. What you see is not real.
And this may look like Morgan Freeman, but this too is another deep fake.
So you may consider this quite realistic, right? And these have been already a couple of years ago. So nowadays you will probably see more realistic versions of different deepfake content. Then how are these deepfakes really being created? There are different set of techniques we can think about that are in place to create this deepfake content out there. One of the techniques is called face swapping, which basically means seamlessly inserting one's face into a target video. And this technique could be used to place a person's face on an actor's body and put them in situations where they were never really in. And also another similar technique we can think of is lip syncing, where a lip syncing mouth will be grafted onto someone else's face, and combining this footage with new audio could even make it more look like they are saying things they are not. Also, facial reenactment means a technique that transfers facial expressions from one person into another video. And with this technique, what you can do is really playing with a person's facial expression and appearance and make them seem either smiley, happy, disgusted, angry, or surprised as you wish. And another technique that is often used is so-called motion transfer, which is basically a technique that transfers the body movements of one person into in a source video to a person in a target video. And for instance, you can capture the motions of a dancer and make target actors move in the same way. And this GIF example you're seeing on slide is a content that was made in collaboration with researchers at the UC Berkeley, where a journalist from Wall Street Journal appeared as if he's dancing like Bruno Mars. I mean, this one seems pretty cool, right? And in the entertainment industry in particular, it can be true that these techniques can be used to significantly lower the cost of movie production, gaming production, or any similar entertainment content production to varying degrees. However, these same techniques of deepfakes can be posing very different kinds of risks and harms on individuals and society across the world. In fact, people around the world are raising wide-ranging concerns surrounding this deepfake technology. And some of the most popular concerns are centered around the issues of mistrust and theft. Let's say, what if we are being led to believe something that is not true? And what if our identity gets stolen for any harmful actors out there to access our bank information, financial information, or something else causing harms on our lives? So on that note, one particular issue area I'd like to focus on today is the unconsented deepfake pornography. There are so many cheap tools out there nowadays using artificial intelligence, which can analyze millions of images at scale very quickly, which allows these AI tools to better predict how one's body will look naked or fluidly overlay one's face to pornographic images. And the issue of deepfake pornography, the reason I chose this in particular is because this issue invites us to confront how we can or how we should articulate the definition and scope of deepfakes. On the one hand, there is a question about whether these content must be deceptive in nature to be classified as a deepfake, so that we can possibly differentiate deepfakes from any other AI-generated media. On the other hand, we could also consider whether there was an explicit or implicit consent from those people portrayed in any deepfake content, as well as whether there was an intention of the forgers to harm these people being depicted in the deepfake content. So there are many layers that we have to consider when it comes to the issue of deepfakes. And in fact, a study found that it's about 96% of deepfake videos online that are pornographic. Moreover, it was also found that deepfake pornographic content tends to exclusively target and harm women in particular. So as you must have learned from one of the assigned readings for today's session, earlier this year in January, Taylor Swift became one of the victims of such unconsented deepfake pornographic content. Fake nude images of her, the global pop star, were spread across social media platforms such as X, previously Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And the images spread on X in particular attracted more than 45 million views, about 24,000 reposts, and hundreds of thousands of likes and bookmarks within the first nearly 17 hours before they were shut down. And it was later known that these fake nude images of her appear to have started on Telegram before going on to other social media platforms that are more wide known to the public. And it's not just Taylor Swift. There are many other examples of women celebrities in particular who have been targets of this similar deepfake pornographic content. At the same time, it's really important for us to acknowledge that it's not just celebrities who are being targeted, but also everyday users and everyday citizens. In this clip that I will show you briefly in a minute, depicts an interview with Noelle Martin from Australia, who was just 18 years old when she became the target of image-based sexual abuse caused by these deepfake technologies.
She has no idea who's responsible for them.
I mean, I just can't explain the level of violation and also shame that I felt, because in the beginning, I kind of blamed myself.
So as you just heard from her in her interview, unfortunately, victims of these abuse can potentially experience so many different harms and issues, including depression, anxiety, and even suicidal ideation. And what's at stake is that these victims are so frustrated and often left without much recourse, because it's very challenging to pinpoint and identify the perpetrators, and to prevent any future abuse, considering the nature of the online environment these images and videos are often circulated.
She has no idea.
Then what protections do we have? Are there any ways for us to protect ourselves and other people? Again, if we think about how these deepfake pornographic content often gets spread across those popular social media platforms, we can think about those community guidelines in place across many of these digital platforms. For example, recalling the case of Taylor Swift, Twitter, now X, did take down the fake nude images of her. As soon as possible, these issues became known to the public. However, before and while X was working on taking down those images, it was actually Swift's huge fan base who took the matters into their own hands, using those features available on a platform like X, where users can flag posts for violation of the community guidelines. And when it comes to Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, which are two of the top popular platforms used globally, similar policies and community guidelines do exist. And if we think about the deepfake porn images, these can be removed for violating Meta's policies on bullying and harassment, especially because deepfake porn content would be considered as derogatory sexualized photoshops or drawings. And Meta also prohibits content that depicts, threatens, or promotes sexual violence, sexual assault, or sexual exploitation, and does not allow porn or sexually explicit advertisements on their platforms. So technically speaking, victims, their allies, and anybody can request these companies to remove deepfake photos and videos. But the problem is that this manual flagging of content by users is not always adequately addressed by these platforms, because platforms tend not to provide users, us, with a holistic account of if, how, and why these posts will remain or be removed. Also, it's actually very hard for these social media companies to identify all the deepfake cases in a timely manner when it is happening at scale very quickly. So even though the content is eventually taken down later, the damages and harms are likely to have already been done on and to the victims, unfortunately. And one of the approaches these platforms have been recently embracing is to label AI-generated media to inform their users about possible content they are encountering. Meta has announced to label manipulated media, which includes AI-generated media. And Google, which owns YouTube, also announced last year that any advertisements which use AI to alter footage of real events or generate a realistic scene must be clearly labeled. The caveat I'd like to highlight, though, is the question as to how effective labeling a content would be in preventing deceptions caused by these deepfake contents. Of course, it would be better than nothing, but not every user will necessarily pay attention to the small label icon when we are inundated by so many information and contents every day on our daily usage. Also, it's usually the paid advertisements that these digital platforms can more meaningfully oversee, whereas many deepfake contents are spread by rather non-paying, non-advertiser accounts as organic contents. And do we have any formal laws in the US? It's yes and no, because there is no federal law on this issue yet as of now. Still, several states, including California, have passed legislation targeting deepfakes, and in California's case, it passed laws for AI use in elections as well as sexual deepfakes. But also the problem is these laws across states vary in scope. In some states, victims can press criminal charges, whereas other states only allow civil lawsuits, so different recourse to different victims residing in different states. Regardless, it can be also very difficult to ascertain whom to sue. The perpetrators, again, if only it is clear and easy to identify them when they are often anonymous and behind a screen. Then the people who consume the content, also it's very hard to identify all of them. And moreover, it's quite often not feasible to prosecute them all at once. And then the social media platforms, there is an intricate system of laws in the US that protect social media platforms from being liable for any content posted by their users. So it's also quite challenging. Then are we doomed? No, not really yet. I'd like to say that there is a silver lining. Congress, the legislators have introduced Defiance Act, which is disrupt explicit forged images and non-consensual edits. And the Senate last week unanimously passed a bipartisan bill to provide some sort of recourse to victims of this porn deepfakes in particular. And once this passes the House, this legislation would allow people to sue those who not only produce, but also distribute or receive the deepfake pornography if they knew or recklessly disregarded the fact that the victim did not consent to those images. So to recap, we did talk about what we mean by deepfakes, and some of the questions we really need to consider and ask as we are trying to scoping the deepfakes is the nature of deception and the intent to harm those people being depicted in the content, as well as any explicit or implicit consent being provided by the people depicted and portrayed in this deepfake content. And then we did talk about the issue of unconsented deepfake pornography, in particular, learning that harms are often imposed on women more disproportionately. And when it comes to any adequate protections and regulations in the US, yes, there are some community guidelines across different social media platforms, but the federal level law doesn't exist yet, and some states are introducing different kinds of laws. So there are lots to be seen. And the last question I'd like to pose for all of us is, what can we do as members of society considering this current state of affairs and the lack of regulations and the fast advancing technology, which introduces techniques like deepfake even? Thank you for listening. I'll close here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beck. It is really troubling, and it feels like it's moving faster than we have the capacity to react to it. So hopefully we start taking some action and get out, at least catch up to it, if not get ahead of it. But right now it feels like the Wild West, not really clear how we can get a handle on it all. So really, really important stuff there. Well, to finish off our wonderful panel today, we have Dr. Dominguez from the Department of Political Science and International Relations. He's going to talk about something very, very important. Hopefully, something that you will count as one of the more important things that you think about as you're here at the university, and that is your own citizenship. She's going to tell us about artificial intelligence and citizenship of the future.
Thank you, Dr. Terrell, and welcome to USD, everybody. So let me do the sharing thing. So I teach American politics. I teach classes in political parties and the presidency and elections and campaigns. And intro to American politics. But for several years, I've also been teaching a class on how democracies die. And so what I'm going to be talking about today builds a little bit on what I teach in that class. And political scientists in general think about power, particularly political power, but that manifests itself in how countries treat each other on the world stage and how we conceive of humanity and human rights and how that's evolved over time and how governments work and how people affect governments and what different governments look like. So that's kind of what political science is about. So I want to just start with, before we talk about how AI, and when we talk about AI, we're talking about all the things that people have been talking about today, which is simulated intelligence in the form of the written word, in the form of pictures and videos, and in the form of just, you go to, you go to one of these chat GPT things and you get it to write a letter for you, get it to write an essay for you, which we hope you don't do. But what does that technology in its evolving state mean for democratic government, which is a fundamentally human creation? So I just want to start with a definition of what democracy is. So democracy is government by laws. It's not government by, the opposite of that is government by the arbitrary decisions and rules and definitions of some leader or some cabal of leaders, right? We have laws that are written in advance and that everybody agrees to live under, more or less. Those laws in a democracy are made by officials chosen through competitive elections. In those elections, all adults have to have the right to vote. And in democracies, we recognize human rights, that humans are dignified beings and that there are certain things that the government can't do to them, that there are zones of action in which the government has to at least have a good reason to detain someone, for example. So people who study comparative politics, which is governments around the world, and of course, American politics and political theory and other things, have tried to identify, okay, so where does democracy come from? Because the framers of our Constitution kind of wrote the Federalist Papers and talked about, well, where does democracy come from? Well, it comes from, a careful structure of institutions. We write down a constitution and then we will have what they called a republic and what we today call democracy. But it turns out that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And that it's not just, you can't just like write down a series of institutions and say, well, you're going to have elections and then therefore, ta-da, you have a democracy. Because you can have elections that are entirely pretend, right? Where everybody knows that if you don't vote for the party in power, they're going to come and murder your family, right? The government will come and kill you. So that's not an election. That's not a free and fair government. That's not a democracy. It doesn't recognize the individual humanity of citizens. And so how do we get that, right? So it's not just government institutions, but it's also the way our society is set up, and it's the way that people behave. And to go back to Pinocchio a little bit, it's, people have to behave themselves in certain ways, in democratic ways, in order to have democracy over the long term. So institutions are important, right? You have to have the lawmaking power vested in elected officials. Particularly, you can't have the military running the government or the bureaucrats, and you generally want to have a strong legislative body rather than a strong executive. There has to be what we call checks and balances in the United States. Doesn't have to look like our checks and balances to have democratic government, but you have to have some kind of horizontal accountability, right? That the people in power are subject to the law. And there's some recent Supreme Court decisions that maybe call that into question, which President Biden was suggesting we amend the Constitution to clarify that. Anyway, that's a subject for another day. But there has to be, the rule of law has to apply to the people in power. Otherwise, they will use the power that they are given by the voters to amass more power for themselves, taking it away from citizens and denying the equality of human rights that's so essential to democratic government. So there has to be some kind of checks and balances, although not necessarily like ours. And there have to be clear rules about how do you get power. So that's enforceable election laws and free and fair democratic elections. So democratic government, the founders of our Constitution weren't wrong. Like democracies do have to have some particular kinds of institutions. But if you have those institutions, that's not enough. You also have to have a vibrant, what political scientists and social theorists call a vibrant civil society. So you have to be able to have alternative sources of information that are not controlled by the government, about which the public can make decisions about whether they want to change what the government is doing, right? Through our elections, we get to say, we don't like what you're doing, throw the bums out. And the free press is among those most important civil society institutions, but it's not the only one. So you have to, in order to have democratic governance, you also have to have other sources of information and authority that people can turn to. So government does not control how people understand the world. And so universities are actually a really important institution in civil society, religions, charities, social clubs, other places where people can can meet with each other and establish relationships and talk about what's going on without fear of prosecution by the government, so that they're sort of free, and those institutions can also like see a problem and try to solve it and not be dependent on the government for everything. In addition to having a vibrant civil society and to having certain qualities of government institutions, there has to be a buy-in to the idea that everybody gets a chance to participate, and we're going to have different ideas, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and there has to be tolerance of your political opponents. And it's really important that it's the elites that have that tolerance, so that they don't, when they're in power, write the laws so that they never leave power. And the elites themselves have to be committed to the rule of law and to be against corruption and to say, oh, that guy over there, he's in my party, but he's corrupt, so I'm not going to talk to him. Okay, he can be prosecuted, whatever. And so those elite norms are also really important to sustaining democracy. But so are some norms that citizens have to adhere to, particularly social norms against dehumanization. When you have dehumanization, that is to say, when some citizens deny the equal humanity of their fellow citizens, or say, you're not citizens at all, you're not even people, right? That's what dehumanization is. That's how you get the denial of political equality, taking away rights, and the abuse of government power against some people in the community. And the United States has a very long and rich history of dehumanizing fellow citizens, such that women weren't considered people, right? Or citizens. They couldn't own property, they couldn't vote. People of color, especially African Americans, were considered, not full human beings and were not allowed to vote until the Civil War helped to, and then 100 years later, the civil rights movement helped to bring that about. So it's not like the United States hasn't evolved on this issue, but that's why some people will say the United States wasn't even a democracy really until 1965, until the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So the people have to behave and believe in equality in order for democracy to exist. Political equality in particular, political theorists like Robert Dahl argue that political equality is the essential thing that you must have in a democracy. You have to have elections, but you must have political equality, or what you have is not really democracy. And you're going to have the abuse of state power and the denial of human rights of some of the people in the community. In addition, people aren't exactly sure how to define this, but there's something about having a society that is not insanely tipped toward a few rich people and a large number of poor people. And nobody knows exactly where those boundaries are, but having relatively low levels of economic inequality, or conversely, some people talk about it as having the important thing is having a large middle class. That seems to be important too, and that's because of the relationship to dehumanization, right? If there's a large number of poor people and all the rich have everything and the poor have nothing, well, then it's easy for the poor to dehumanize the rich and to try to use violence against them. And conversely, the rich people can think they're the good people, they're the real people, and the poor don't. They're not real people, so they don't deserve rights and to participate. So relative levels of economic inequality, of economic equality also support democracy. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background on how we might define democracy and think about its vulnerabilities. Like where are the places there that that careful balance of institutions and norms that supports democratic rule? You know, how does the emergence of artificial intelligence pose challenges for that balance? And in particular, I think norms around mutual trust and toleration and a shared information environment upon which we can make decisions about, you know, what is in the public interest. Those stand out to me and to many other political scientists as being, you know, places where maybe we see some vulnerabilities. Although it's a little harder to see how institutions themselves are threatened, although I will say, when Dr. Bake was talking about deepfakes, the head of the elections division of the state of Arizona created a deepfake and sent it out to all of the elections officials in all of the counties saying, you know, this is a deepfake of me saying, stop counting the votes. But I'm not really saying that. This is a deepfake of me saying that, just to illustrate some of the ways in which our institutions themselves might be vulnerable to deepfakes. So the answer is, you know, to the question of how might democracy be vulnerable or, you know, be affected by or changed by the emergence of artificial intelligence, we don't really know. Like, nobody knows. We could be worried about things that aren't really going to be a problem. We could be not seeing problems that are going to be our doom. We don't know. But as you read in the article for today, some people who think a lot about democracy and these issues do have some real concerns. So I'll go over a couple of those and I'll add a couple to the ones that were mentioned in the reading. So the first concern that was discussed by the authors in the reading concerns the importance of citizen input into democratic governance. That when you write a letter or make a phone call or show up at your member of Congress's office, that's all information they use, right? I mean, that members of Congress want to get reelected. They want to do what the public wants them to do. And so, and certainly, you know, organized lobbyists have long been, you know, trying to make it seem like the public's on their side, right? There's a lot. It's a very complex environment already, but if you introduce into that, you know, I will confess that I have used artificial intelligence to ChatGPT to write a letter to my HOA about something I was really mad about. And I was just so mad I couldn't write it myself, so I had ChatGPT do it for me. But, you know, if at scale, artificial intelligence enables lots of letters, lots of input, lots of, emails to members of Congress, that dilutes what members of Congress, they're like not necessarily going to read one letter and think, I must do this thing because some constituent wants it. But if those real citizen opinions are diluted by a lot of junk that's generated by artificial intelligence, that makes it harder for members of Congress to know what the public really wants. Their second point in the reading is, if we want good government, good democratic government that does what's good for the people, then the people who are writing the laws have to be good at it, right? They have to know what they're doing and they have to care about, accurate information. And if we are going to choose good lawmakers, then we have to have good information about who they are and what would they do, and not have that be diluted by a lot of misinformation or disinformation or lies or mistruths or the kinds of things that people might say about elected officials that might not be accurate. And so, one of the concerns, again, about AI is the sheer volume of potential misinformation and maybe just distractions, maybe just like we look to our phones, we look to social media, we look to fake news sites, that look to us, they could look totally real. But if we're getting a lot of misinformation ourselves about what our elected officials are doing, then maybe we vote for people that really aren't going to act in our interests. Or maybe we don't vote. Maybe we're just like, oh, these people are all terrible. I don't like any of them. I'm going to not vote at all. And neither of those is great for having a government that accurately represents the wishes of the people. So the really trashy information environment that AI can help to create, both through misinformation and just through too much information, is perhaps a bad thing. 3, in this environment in which you see something on your phone, you're like, I don't know if this is true. I don't know if I trust this website. I don't know if this is real. I don't know if this is a deep fake. Never mind. I'm just gonna look at cats. Untrustworthy information can make people just not believe anything. Even the good stuff, even the true good stuff, people just tune it out. And then when people tune it out, then they don't participate and they don't critique and they don't hold their lawmakers to account and they don't think about what's important and try to act about that because they think nothing matters, or that everything is corrupt, or right. They lose faith in the system in part because of the diluted information environment. Those are from the reading. I'll add a couple of others. I mean, I think one of the things, and I actually wanted to include, I would include in my discussion here, I would include deepfake pornography, but AI can generate misinformation. It can generate, or it can help through bots and other things, just rapidly spread dehumanizing rhetoric and images that undermine that essential democratic contract of mutual respect and toleration of political opponents. And it doesn't have to be artificial intelligence, right? It's most important that people in the political process aren't doing this, but artificial intelligence can participate in that by generating images and stories and videos that create enemies within the citizenry. And once that's created, once people are dehumanized, it becomes pretty easy to use democratic government to do terrible things. And then finally, and this is maybe more of a professor type concern, but AI, like if you've Googled anything lately, right? Meta has started, Google used to give you like, here's a website, you have a question about how tornadoes are formed. Here's a website, here's a website, here's a website. And you can like look at the websites and be like, oh, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or that's MIT, or that's Joe's blog. And I can I could at least evaluate those things for myself, but now Google is giving us an AI overview. So the first thing that pops up is Google's AI, artificial intelligence summary of what the internet says about where tornadoes come from. And I'm old and uncomfortable with that because I think that information is important and I want to know where it's coming from, and I'm uncomfortable with, I'm not sure I necessarily trust that artificial intelligence is good at telling us what's true and what's not true. But that is a role into which people are going to be increasingly accustomed to getting information from the AI overview. And there's no fact check of that. And it concerns me personally, because I think having a shared understanding of reality is how we can talk about, although we have different values, we can all see that this is a problem and we would like to try to fix it and find ways to fix it that we're all sort of okay with, or that some people are going to lose, but most of us are okay with, right? That's what democracy is bargaining about how to solve problems in ways that reflect both our values, but also a shared reality. And to the degree that artificial intelligence steps into places where we have otherwise established institutions for establishing shared reality, I don't know what that means. We don't know exactly where that's going to take us. Okay. So just to end on a happier note here, what can we do to safeguard democracy from these challenges that the emergence of these new technologies might pose to it? I would say there's a couple things. I mean, one is be good consumers of information. Like, don't just believe everything that you see. But on the other hand, you can't go the opposite direction and not believe anything either, right? Because the authoritarians really like that. They like people to be just, oh, nothing's real. Never mind. The public space is just all polluted. That's not a place where people can act together in the interest of the common good. That's not a democratic information environment. So we personally have to work harder to be good consumers of especially political information, but of information generally, and not believe everything you see, but not believe nothing either. And that requires a level of personal responsibility, to be educated about the world, that's one of the things that you get out of a liberal arts education at a school like USD is you get to be educated about the world and to have some knowledge against which you can check. Wait a second, I don't think that doesn't sound right to me. I'm pretty sure I learned about that one time. And it's not like information, doesn't get better over time and change through the scientific process, but like learning about the world and learning and being informed about diverse cultures and your community and your country, that's not something that AI is necessarily going to help with. There may be tools that can make that easier, but really being a democratic citizen is about your taking responsibility for being a democratic citizen. And it's not something I think that can be, citizenship is not something that can be done entirely online. There's too many fake people out there in social media and especially in an AI generated world where it's not just some account on some social media site. It could look like a real person, but it's not, right? So I think democracy fundamentally is an in-person sport, right? It's not a spectator sport. It's something in which we have to engage actively. And as long as we're doing that and talking to people, even and especially people we disagree with, in a tolerant and in a tolerant way, then I think we'll probably make it work. So that's my 2 cents for today.